Judge slowly lifted the sealed file and studied it in silence for several seconds. His eyes moved to my older brother, then to my parents sitting shoulder to shoulder behind their attorney. Finally, he looked at me. "Are you certain everyone in this courtroom understands what's inside this file?" I gave a single nod. "Yes, Your Honor." 11 minutes later, my mother was crying, my brother was shouting at the judge, and my father sat perfectly still, staring at his hands as though he had finally realized what 10 years of silence had cost him. But that courtroom was only the ending. Everything had started 9 years earlier. On a freezing November night, with a doorbell, and with a little boy nobody wanted. Welcome back. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country or city in the comments, and if you enjoy emotional family stories with unforgettable twists, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another one. My name is Hannah. I'm 35 years old now. 9 years ago, I worked as a pediatric nurse at a regional hospital just outside Asheville. Back then, I believed there wasn't much left that could shock me. I'd seen newborns fighting for every breath, parents praying through impossible nights, families willing to sacrifice everything for their children, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened after one exhausting 12-hour shift. It was almost 10:30 at night. Cold rain hammered against my windshield as I pulled into the driveway of my little rental house. I was already thinking about a hot shower and maybe 4 hours of sleep before my next shift. Then I heard it. A faint cry. At first I ignored it. I figured it was someone's cat. But the sound came again, higher this time. A baby's cry. I froze. My porch light illuminated something sitting right in front of my door, an old stroller. Rainwater dripped from its worn fabric. I hurried toward it, my heart pounding. Inside, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, was a tiny baby boy. He couldn't have been more than a month old. His cheeks were cold. His tiny hands trembled. The nurse in me took over before the frightened woman did. I checked his breathing, his pulse, his temperature. He had a slight fever, but he was breathing steadily. Without thinking, I picked him up. The moment I held him against my chest, he stopped crying. It felt as though he'd simply been waiting for someone to find him. Tucked beside the blanket was a plain white envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, only 2 short sentences. "Please take care of him, you're his only chance." No signature, no explanation, no phone number, nothing. Have you ever had one of those moments when you realize your entire life has just changed forever? That's exactly how it felt. I called 911 immediately. Within 20 minutes, police officers and paramedics arrived. While they examined the baby, one officer asked me, "Do you recognize him?" "No." "Do you know who left him here?" I shook my head. "I've never seen him before." At least, that's what I believed. Until another officer searched the stroller. Hidden inside a small side pocket was a faded photograph. 2 young women, smiling, arms around each other. The moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. One of those women was me, the other was my younger sister, Emily. Emily had disappeared almost a year earlier. No goodbye, no explanation. She simply vanished. My parents claimed they had no idea where she'd gone. The police never found her. By sunrise, I couldn't stop staring at that old photograph. Something deep inside me whispered that this wasn't a coincidence. Later that morning, I drove straight to my parents' house with the baby asleep in the back seat. My mother answered the door. The instant she saw the little boy, every bit of color drained from her face. "Where did you get that, child?" Instead of answering, I handed her the photograph. "I think Emily left him." My father slowly took the picture. His hands began to shake for a moment. I thought he was about to tell me the truth. Instead, my mother said something that shattered whatever hope I still had. "Take him to social services." I stared at her. "What? That child has nothing to do with us." "Mom, he's just a baby. He's Emily's mistake." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "No," I replied quietly. "He's an innocent little boy." She folded her arms. "Then let him become someone else's responsibility." I looked at my father. He lowered his eyes, didn't say a single word, not one, and in that heartbreaking moment, I realized I hadn't only found an abandoned baby that night. I had just discovered how easily some people can abandon their own family too. I couldn't move. I kept staring at my phone long after the call had ended. Ben was lying on a blanket in the living room, giggling as he reached for a stuffed rabbit, completely unaware that my entire world had just shifted. Emily was alive. I'd heard her voice. After nearly a year of silence, she was alive. But she hadn't sounded free. That man's voice echoed in my head. Hang up. Then the scream, then silence. I replayed the conversation over and over. Was I imagining things? No. Every instinct I had as a nurse and as a sister told me something was terribly wrong. The next morning, I went straight to Detective Mason Carter, the officer who had handled the case the night Ben was found. He listened carefully while I described the phone call. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. Did you recognize the man's voice? No. Did your sister mention a name? I shook my head. Nothing, he sighed. The call lasted less than a minute. We'll try to trace it, but without more information. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, I understood. Still, I refused to believe Emily had simply abandoned her son. Not anymore. Something else was happening, something none of us understood. A week later, Child Protective Services officially placed Ben in my long-term foster care while they continued searching for Emily. The social worker, Rebecca Mills, smiled as she handed me the paperwork. You know, she said, most people panic when they suddenly become responsible for a baby. I looked toward Ben, who had just discovered that banging a plastic spoon against the kitchen floor created a wonderful noise. I don't have time to panic, she laughed. I think he's lucky. Maybe he was, or maybe I was. Life slowly found a rhythm. My mornings started before sunrise, coffee brewing, Ben laughing in his high chair. Packing his diaper bag before heading to work. The nurses at the hospital practically adopted him as their mascot. Every week someone showed up with something new, tiny shoes, children's books, a handmade blanket. One elderly volunteer knitted him a blue sweater with little bears on the sleeves. She smiled and whispered, "Every child deserves someone who stays." Those words stayed with me. Months turned into a year. Ben learned to crawl, then to stand. Then to take his first shaky steps across my living room. The first word he ever said wasn't mama. It wasn't hi. It was light. Every evening before bed, he'd point toward the glowing porch light outside the window. The same porch light that had been shining the night I found him. It became our little ritual. Before bedtime, I'd ask, should we leave the light on? He'd clap his tiny hands. Light, so I never turned it off. Can you imagine how strange life can be? One small habit can become the thing that reminds a child they're safe. 2 years passed. There was still no sign of Emily. My parents never called, not once. I still emailed them photographs every month. Ben's birthday, his first day at preschool, his first haircut, his first Christmas. Every email ended exactly the same way. If you'd ever like to meet him, our door is open. Not a single reply. Then one rainy afternoon, someone knocked. I opened the door expecting a delivery driver. Instead, a tall man in his late 30s stood on my porch. He wore work boots covered in sawdust and held an old baseball cap in both hands. You must be Hannah. I am. My name is Daniel Brooks. His voice was calm, respectful. I think. He swallowed hard. I think I might be Ben's father. For a second, I honestly forgot how to breathe. He quickly raised both hands. I know how this sounds. I didn't come here to take him away. I didn't even know he existed until 3 days ago. I studied his face. There was no anger, no demands, only nervousness and something else, regret. I have proof, he said quietly. He reached into a worn leather folder and carefully pulled out a faded photograph. It showed him, standing beside Emily. Both of them smiling. The picture had clearly been taken years before Ben was born. I've spent the last 2 years wondering why she disappeared. He looked toward the hallway where Ben was happily singing to himself while stacking toy blocks. Then Daniel said something that instantly made every alarm bell go off in my mind. I don't think Emily ran away, he lowered his voice. I think someone made her disappear, and somehow, deep inside, I already knew he was right. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that man's voice again. You should never have kept the boy. It wasn't just a threat. It sounded like a warning from someone who believed he was already in control. By sunrise, Daniel was standing outside my house with 2 cups of coffee. Neither of us mentioned the black SUV right away. Instead, we watched Ben through the kitchen window as he sat on the living room floor, carefully lining up his toy cars in a perfectly straight row. He does that every morning? Daniel asked. I smiled. Every single day, Daniel laughed quietly. Emily used to organize everything the same way. For a second, the tension disappeared. Then I noticed Daniel staring toward the street again. The SUV isn't here today. Maybe it was nothing. He looked at me. No, I've spent years learning the difference between coincidence and surveillance. That sentence made my stomach tight. We decided to visit Detective Mason together. When we explained the anonymous phone call and the suspicious vehicle, his expression became serious. Did either of you recognize the voice? We both shook our heads. The license plate? I couldn't see it, he sighed. Without evidence, there's not much I can officially do. I expected Daniel to become frustrated. Instead, he reached into his backpack and placed an old flash drive on the detective's desk. I found this inside Emily's storage unit yesterday. Detective Mason frowned. You had access to her storage unit? I only found the key last week. The detective plugged the drive into his computer. Several folders appeared. Family photos, scanned documents, hospital records. Then, one folder simply labeled Private Mason clicked it. Only one video file. The date shocked all of us. Recorded just 6 days before Emily disappeared. The detective pressed play. Emily appeared on the screen. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red from crying. She kept glancing behind her before speaking. If anyone is watching this, she whispered, ... it means something happened to me. Daniel covered his mouth. I couldn't breathe. Emily continued. I haven't told anyone because I don't know who I can trust anymore. She looked directly into the camera. If you're Hannah, she paused. I'm sorry. Tears rolled down her face. I never wanted you involved. The video suddenly glitched. Static filled the screen for several seconds, then her voice returned. If anything happens to my baby, another glitch. Don't let my parents. The recording froze. The screen turned black. No one in the room spoke. Detective Mason replayed the final seconds 3 times. The missing words never returned. Daniel finally whispered, she was trying to tell us something. The detective nodded slowly. More importantly, he looked at both of us. He specifically told Hannah not to trust your parents. My chest tightened. I wanted to argue, to insist there had to be another explanation, but deep down, I remembered my mother's first reaction when she saw Ben. Take him away. Not, is he all right? Not, where's Emily? Just, get rid of him? Had she known more than she'd admitted? That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house alone. I didn't tell Daniel I needed answers. When my mother opened the door, she looked surprised. I thought I made myself clear. I found a video. The color immediately drained from her face. What video? Emily recorded it before she disappeared. My father stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward. What did she say? I stared at both of them. She said one sentence before the recording cut out. I watched every expression on their faces. If anything happens to my baby, don't let my parents. Neither of them moved. Neither denied it. Instead, my father slowly sat back down. He looked 20 years older than the last time I'd seen him. Then, almost in a whisper, he said something that changed everything. Hannah, we've been lying to you. Before I could ask another question, someone smashed a brick through the living room window. Glass exploded across the floor. Wrapped around the brick was a single sheet of paper. Only 5 words were written in black marker. Stop digging, or the boy dies. The black SUV remained parked in the hospital lot. Its headlights were off. The engine was still running. Whoever was inside wasn't in a hurry. They were waiting. Watching, I instinctively pulled Ben closer against my chest. He was asleep, completely unaware that someone might already be planning to take him away. Daniel stood beside the window without moving. That's the same vehicle, he whispered. I'm certain. I looked at him. Should we call Detective Mason? I already did. Almost 20 minutes later, Detective Mason and 2 uniformed officers arrived at the pediatric wing. By then, the SUV was gone. Of course it was. One officer checked the parking lot security cameras while Mason questioned every employee working that afternoon. Nothing. No readable license plate. No clear faces. Whoever they were. They knew exactly how to stay invisible. That evening, Mason asked Daniel and me to meet him in a private conference room. He spread several photographs across the table. Recognize anyone? Daniel studied them first. No, then I looked. Businessmen, security guards, several women. None of them looked familiar until I reached the last photograph. My hand froze. It showed a charity gala held almost 10 years earlier. Hundreds of guests filled the ballroom, but I wasn't looking at the crowd. I was staring at my father. Standing only a few feet away from him was the founder of the Faulkner Foundation, Victor Faulkner. Both men were smiling for the camera. I slowly looked up at Mason. My father said he'd never met these people. Mason folded his arms. That wasn't true. A heavy silence filled the room. Daniel finally spoke. So Hannah's parents weren't just hiding Emily, they were hiding something else. When I returned home that night, every light in the house was on. I checked every room, kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, closets. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. Ben had finally fallen asleep upstairs. I walked into the kitchen to make tea. That's when I noticed it. One cabinet door was slightly open. I always closed it, always, slowly. I opened it wider. Inside, resting neatly on the middle shelf, was a small brown envelope. My name was written across the front. Hannah, no stamp, no address. Someone had placed it there. Inside was a single key, an old-fashioned brass key. And another note, Locker 214, Central Station, go alone. No signature. Daniel arrived 15 minutes later after I called him. The moment he saw the key, he frowned. It's a train station locker. You've seen one before, he nodded. They're rented anonymously. Detective Mason wanted to send officers instead, but something bothered me. If they wanted to hurt us, I said quietly, why leave this? Daniel answered before Mason could, because they want us to find something. The following morning, we drove to Central Station. Plainclothes officers watched from a distance while I walked alone toward locker 214. Every step echoed through the nearly empty hallway. I slipped the brass key into the lock. It turned easily. The metal door creaked open. Inside, there wasn't money or jewelry or documents. There was only one battered children's backpack. I carefully unzipped it. Inside lay a teddy bear, a baby bottle, a tiny blue sweater, and beneath them, a leather journal. The first page made my heart stop. Written in Emily's handwriting were the words, "If Hannah is reading this, I didn't survive." I immediately shut the notebook. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Daniel hurried over. What is it? I looked at him with tears filling my eyes. It's Emily's diary. Before either of us could say another word, someone shouted from the far end of the hallway. He's running. A man wearing a gray hoodie sprinted toward the station exit. Two detectives chased after him. For a moment it looked like they'd catch him. Then, a black motorcycle skidded to a stop outside the entrance. The man jumped onto the back. Within seconds, both disappeared into morning traffic. Detective Mason returned a few minutes later, breathing heavily. We lost them. He looked down at the diary in my hands. No, he corrected himself quietly. I think they wanted us to find that. I stared at Emily's journal. Whatever secrets she had risked her life to protect, they were no longer hidden. They were finally in my hands. None of us slept that night. Not me, not Daniel, not Detective Mason. If someone had entered my home without leaving a trace except for Ben's teddy bear, then they weren't just watching us anymore. They were sending a message. We can reach him whenever we want. I sat beside Ben's bed until sunrise. Every few minutes, I'd reach over and gently touch his little hand just to reassure myself he was still there. Have you ever been so afraid that even silence feels dangerous? That's exactly how I felt. The following morning, Mason arranged police protection around the house. An unmarked patrol car stayed parked a few houses away. Two detectives rotated shifts. For the first time in years, I felt slightly safer, only slightly, because whoever was behind all this had stayed ahead of us from the very beginning. Daniel spent the afternoon reading every page of Emily's diary. Most entries were ordinary. She wrote about morning sickness, doctor appointments, baby names, dreams of becoming a mother. Then everything changed. One entry caught Mason's attention immediately. Victor believes the records have already been destroyed. He doesn't know I made copies. Mason underlined the sentence. Copies? He looked at us. That means Emily hid evidence somewhere. Daniel nodded. And whoever's after us still hasn't found it. We searched the diary for hours. Nothing, no address, no map, no locker number, no clue. Just before midnight, Daniel suddenly stopped turning the pages. Hannah, I looked up. What? He held the diary toward me. Read the first letter of every chapter. I frowned. There were 12 short chapters. Each began with a handwritten title. We wrote down the first letter of each one. Together they formed a sentence. Look inside the music box. I stared at the words. Music box, Daniel's eyes widened. Emily had one, so did I whispered. The realization hit me instantly. When we were children, our grandmother had given each of us an identical wooden music box for Christmas. Mine was still in the attic. I hadn't opened it in years. Within minutes, Daniel and I were climbing the narrow attic stairs. Dust covered everything. Old furniture, boxes, Christmas decorations. Finally, I found it. A faded wooden music box with tiny carved roses around the edges. I carefully wound the key. The familiar melody filled the attic. For just a moment, I wasn't 35 anymore. I was 8 years old again. Emily and I were dancing around our grandmother's living room, laughing, completely unaware of how life would change. Daniel gently interrupted my thoughts. Hannah, he pointed toward the bottom of the box. There was a tiny crack in the wood. Almost invisible, using a small screwdriver, he carefully lifted the false bottom. Hidden beneath it was a tiny memory card, no larger than a fingernail. We all looked at each other. Emily had hidden it years before anyone knew she was missing. Detective Mason immediately inserted the card into his laptop. Hundreds of files appeared, scanned contracts, bank transfers, birth certificates, private emails, photographs. Everything, years of evidence. Mason leaned back in disbelief. This, he whispered, is enough to destroy the entire organization. Daniel looked relieved for the first time since we'd met. We finally have what Emily died trying to protect. Before anyone could celebrate, Mason's phone rang. He answered. His expression changed instantly. What? A long silence. No, he slowly lowered the phone. What happened? I asked. He looked directly at me. The judge assigned to this investigation. My stomach tightened. Was killed in a car explosion 30 minutes ago. Nobody spoke. Mason continued quietly. The files weren't public. Only 4 people knew about today's meeting. His eyes moved from Daniel to me and finally toward the front door. There is only one explanation. Someone was leaking information from inside the investigation itself. The people hunting Ben didn't just have money. They had someone inside law enforcement. For a split second, nobody moved. Detective Mason's pistol was aimed directly at Daniel. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear myself think. Daniel slowly raised both hands. Mason, he said quietly, if you're really involved, then at least tell us why. The detective didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a long sigh. I was hoping that phone call would never happen. My stomach dropped. Emily had said his name, and now he wasn't denying it. Ben was asleep in the next room. Only a thin wooden wall separated him from us. Every instinct in my body screamed that I had to protect him. Mason noticed me glancing toward the hallway. Don't, his voice remained calm. If you run, this ends badly. Daniel stepped slightly in front of me without making it obvious. I'll stay here, he said. Let Hannah take Ben. Mason shook his head. No one leaves. The room fell silent. Then, he slowly lowered the gun only a few inches. I've lied to both of you. Daniel's eyes narrowed. But not about everything. I've spent 6 years pretending to work for them. I frowned. What? They believe I'm one of them? They have no idea I've been building a case against them. I couldn't tell if he was telling the truth or inventing another lie. Emily knew, he continued. That's why she said my name. Daniel looked confused. She told us never to trust you. No, Mason replied. She told you not to trust anyone until you found me. Before either of us could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. His face instantly changed. They're here. What? They found the cabin. At that exact moment, a loud engine echoed outside, then another. Headlights flashed through the living room windows. 3 black SUVs rolled slowly into the driveway. Daniel pulled the curtains aside just enough to look. There are at least 8 of them. Mason immediately handed Daniel his pistol. Can you shoot? Daniel nodded. I served 4 years in the army. Good. He turned to me. Hannah, take Ben. What about you? We'll hold them as long as we can. My eyes filled with tears. I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice. Outside, car doors slammed shut. Heavy footsteps approached the house. Someone shouted, "Bring us the child." Another voice answered, "We know you're inside." The front door shook violently, once, Twice then, crash, the lock splintered. Someone had forced the door open. Daniel positioned himself behind the kitchen wall. Mason switched off every light in the cabin. Darkness swallowed the room. Only moonlight entered through the windows. I ran upstairs. Ben was still asleep. How? I quickly wrapped him in a blanket and held him against my chest. He opened his sleepy little eyes. "Hannah, it's okay," I whispered. "I'm here." Downstairs, a gunshot exploded through the house. Then another. Wood shattered somewhere below. Men shouted. Glass broke. Ben buried his face against my shoulder. He started crying. I fought back my own tears. "It's okay," I whispered again, even though I no longer believed it. Then I remembered something, the old cabin map. When we'd arrived, the retired judge had joked about an emergency exit built during the Cold War, a narrow tunnel beneath the basement. I hurried downstairs. Smoke filled the hallway. Daniel was exchanging gunfire with two masked men behind the staircase. Mason stood near the broken front door, covering him. He saw me. "The tunnel," he yelled. "Go now." I rushed toward the basement door. One of the attackers noticed me. "There," he shouted. "She's got the boy." Footsteps thundered behind me. I reached the basement. The hidden wooden hatch was exactly where the judge had described. With trembling hands, I pulled it open. A narrow concrete passage stretched into darkness just as I climbed inside. A bullet struck the wall inches from my head. Pieces of stone sprayed across my face. I slammed the hatch shut from the inside. Everything became silent, except for Ben's frightened breathing, and then, through the thick concrete, I heard Daniel scream my name. "Hannah, run!" I froze for one terrible moment. I couldn't tell whether that scream meant he was still alive, or whether it was the last thing he would ever say. "Hannah, run!" Daniel's voice echoed through the tunnel. Then, silence, no more gunshots, no more shouting, only the sound of my own heartbeat and Ben's frightened breathing against my shoulder. I didn't know if Daniel was alive. I didn't know if Detective Mason had survived. All I knew was one thing. I couldn't stop, not now, not after everything Emily had sacrificed. The tunnel seemed endless. Cold water dripped from the ceiling. Every few steps I looked back, half expecting someone to come crawling after us. Ben had stopped crying. He simply wrapped his tiny arms around my neck. "Hannah," he whispered sleepily. "I'm scared. So am I admitted quietly. "But I promise, no matter what happens, I won't let anyone take you away." Sometimes courage isn't the absence of fear. Sometimes it's simply refusing to quit while you're terrified. After what felt like forever, I climbed through a rusted metal hatch hidden beneath a pile of fallen branches. Fresh air hit my face. I had emerged deep inside a forest nearly half a mile from the cabin. Smoke drifted through the trees. In the distance, I heard sirens. For a moment, I wanted to run back, to find Daniel, to find Mason. But Ben needed me, so I kept walking. Nearly 40 minutes later, an elderly couple spotted us on a quiet country road. The woman immediately rushed over. "My goodness, what happened to you?" I couldn't even explain. I simply whispered, "Please, call the police." Within minutes, patrol cars surrounded us. This time, none of the officers were familiar faces. Oddly enough, that made me feel safer. We were taken to a secure federal facility where I finally met Special Prosecutor Eva Kruger. She greeted me with a tired smile. "Hannah, I've wanted to meet you for a long time." I frowned. "You know who I am," she nodded. "So did Detective Mason." She placed a laptop on the table. "He transferred every file from Emily's memory card to us 15 minutes before the attack." I stared at her. "So, he knew they were coming." She lowered her eyes. "He stayed behind to make sure you escaped." For the first time since entering the tunnel, I broke down completely. I'd spent days wondering whether Mason had betrayed us instead. He had risked everything to protect us. 3 weeks later, the largest criminal investigation in the state's history officially began. Emily's hidden files exposed everything: illegal adoptions, forged birth certificates, money laundering, bribed officials, corrupt lawyers, powerful businessmen, even judges. One by one, arrests were made across the country. News stations covered the story every single day. Families who had spent years searching for their children finally received answers. Dozens of lives were changed because one frightened young woman had refused to stay silent. When the trial began, I testified for nearly 6 hours. The courtroom was silent as I described the night Ben was left on my doorstep. The anonymous threats, the diary, the tunnel, everything. When I finished, the judge looked around the courtroom before speaking. In 30 years on the bench, I have never witnessed courage like this. I shook my head. It wasn't just me, it was Emily, it was Daniel, and it was Detective Mason. Without them, none of us would be here today. On the final day of the trial, the courtroom doors suddenly opened. A federal marshal walked quickly toward Prosecutor Kruger and whispered something into her ear. She smiled. Then she turned toward me. "Hannah, we found them." My heart nearly stopped. "Who?" "Daniel," she paused, "and Detective Mason." Both had survived, seriously injured. Both had managed to escape into the woods after the attack before rescue teams finally located them days later. I covered my face with both hands. For the first time in months, I cried tears of relief instead of fear. 6 months later, Ben officially became my son. The adoption papers were signed. The courtroom where everything had begun was now the place where our new life officially started. Daniel remained part of Ben's life every single day, not because a judge ordered it, but because family isn't built only by blood, it's built by love. Emily was never found. Whether she escaped or gave her life protecting her son, we may never know. But every year on her birthday, Ben and I place a candle in our front window. One evening he looked up at me and asked, "Who is the light for?" I smiled through tears. "For the bravest woman I've ever known." Some people save lives by staying, others save lives by sacrificing everything they have. Emily did both. Thank you so much for listening to this story until the very end. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments what you would have done in Hannah's place. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another emotional story.